Hello and welcome to another HanDrinksSolo Wine Report. Yesterday I had the privilege of attending Kanonkop's Paul Sauer 2019 review tasting on the estate in Stellenbosch. Now the Paul Sauer blend is Kanonkop's Bordeaux style flagship reserve red blend, but the tasting included some fascinating older vintages, wines from their Cabernet Sauvignon range, their Pinotage range, and even the KADETTE range CAB Blend. The tasting experience was enlightening on a whole number of fronts, which I will try to share with you as briefly as possible, and I will also include some comparative wine scores right at the end of the video. But if the scores are all you came for, then feel free to click on the chapter in the video timeline below titled The Scores. Before we can head straight into talking about Kanonkop's new releases, I think we need to take a little bit of time to look at Bradley Cooper in his youth. Okay, so this is him when he was getting friend-zoned in the first season of Alias by Sydney Bristow. And I mean, sure, he's cute, but is he really boyfriend material? Clearly not, as far as Sydney Bristow was concerned. Of course, then he comes back in season 3 or 4, and then he's all changed. And fast forward a decade later, and all of a sudden he's shirtless on magazines everywhere, and certainly out of the friend zone as far as the general public is concerned. Now, of course, there was a Hollywood casting agent who spotted talent early on in Bradley, but the man still had a long way to go before he could develop the sort of mystique that allows him to play face in the A-Team, for example. And I think the same thing can be said about a lot of wines. Even the best made wines in their youth seem to have a long way to go. Wines that are built to age, by definition, are incomplete versions of themselves when they are young. So hold on to the image of Bradley Cooper and young wines until the end, where it'll all make sense. But to start out, I need to give you some context, because I start talking about Kanonkop and you might be sitting at home saying,
who are these guys?
For those of you who are unfamiliar with Kanonkop, it is a producer from the country of South Africa, down on the southern tip of the African continent in a region called Stellenbosch. Now, Stellenbosch is kind of the South African wine version of the Ivy League, I guess. Very established, kind of elite, and for the most part will attract the best and brightest at some point during their career in the South African winelands. More specifically, Kanonkop itself is laid out over the foothills of the Simonsberg, which is a little neighborhood that plays host to some of South Africa's most lauded and established producers. For the most part, all of Kanonkop's vines are planted in decomposed granite soils. Kanonkop as an estate made quite a splash in the 1980s with their Pinotage. First off, when legendary South African winemaker Bdx won the Diners Club International Winemaker of the Year for his 1987 Pinotage. That same winemaker, Bdx, then went on to win the Robert Mondavi Award for International Winemaker of the Year with his 1991 Kanonkop Pinotage. And so while during that time Pinotage was very much being splashed across the headlines, Kanonkop as an estate already had an attitude of reverence towards Cabernet Sauvignon. And in fact, if Bdx was pushed, he would have said that Cabernet Sauvignon was as much of a focus as Pinotage was. And in case it wasn't obvious from all the things that I've said about Kanonkop already, they seem to be a very important part of what forms the opinion of the global fine wine scene when it comes to deciding what South African wine is or isn't. And then moving on from the late 80s, early 90s, we fast forward roughly 25 years to the year 2018, where now the head winemaker is Aubrey Beerslaw. In fact, he's been head winemaker since 2003, and during that time, he has won International Winemaker of the Year 2008, 2015, and 2018. Not only that, but the 2015 release of Paul Sauer, which was vinified by Aubrey Beerslaw, went and became the first current release South African wine to earn a perfect 100 points, courtesy of Master of Wine Tim Atkin. And even today, 4 years later, it is one of only about 7 or 8 South African wines that have ever scored a perfect 100 points. And that 2018 award could not have come at a better time, because Kanonkop, with their eye firmly set on the future, had just tripled the capacity of their cellar from a 1,000-ton capacity up to a 3,000-ton capacity. They had also installed a massive bank of open concrete tanks, which was something that they, even though concrete tanks take up more space, cost a lot to implement, and then also require these massive mechanical punch-down machines, it was something that they decided was very important to maintain quality at scale because of the way the winemaker can be so up close and personal with the grapes, something that is not possible when you're working with sealed tanks. They also installed a bunch of really fancy optical sorters so that the actual berries going into each wine was sorted far better than any human system could possibly achieve.
But why
Well, mostly because it's quite important to understand that Kanonkop have not just set out to make some of the finest wines in the world, but they've got an eye to do so at scale. This is a producer who is looking to produce enough high quality wine to make an impact at a global level in the fine wine community. Even if we ignore the larger production of their KADETTE range, which runs into the millions of bottles, even just focusing on the little tippy top reserve flagship Bordeaux blend Paul Sauer, they produce over 40,000 bottles each vintage, and do so at a quality level that comfortably sits alongside brands like Sassicaia or Ridge Estate or Penfolds or Opus One. And you might say,
look, I don't need a history lesson.
Fair enough. Let's move on to my takeaways from yesterday's tasting at the release of the Paul Sauer 2019 vintage. My first takeaway is that the Kanonkop KADETTE range is well worth cellaring. The KADETTE range is essentially a supermarket range of wine distributed throughout major retailers nationwide and internationally. Another thing to note about it is that it retails at roughly a third of the price of their reserve wines. Now, winemaker Aubrey Breslauer swears that this is not a second label, which is a little bit silly because it quite clearly is a second label. As I said, it retails for a third of the price. It undergoes far shorter maturation cycles and is also produced with fruit that is not Kanonkop Estate fruit, albeit it is 100% wine of origin Stellenbosch. But I think the point that Aubrey was trying to make is that this is a range that garners a huge amount of his attention and his desire to produce, again, high quality relative to incredibly large scale. Now, having tasted the 2013 KADETTE Pinotage and the 2014 KADETTE Cape Blend, I can confidently say that he is achieving this goal. These are both very classy wines at roughly 8 years of age. So if you're one of those wine lovers who simply cannot fathom why a wine should ever cost more than $200 or perhaps $20 if you're in the United States, then this is a range of wines that you can happily save on by spending $150 or say $15 and cellar it for 8 to 10 years and still come out with that satisfaction of getting some sort of sensorial return on investment much, much later. You're rewarded for your patience and your frugality. But mercifully, that is not where it ends for Kanonkop, because Kanonkop really do produce some legitimate fine wines. And it's one of these fine wines, the Kanonkop Cabernet Sauvignon, that brings me to my second takeaway. And that is that Cabernet Sauvignon from Kanonkop is a sleeping giant. I cannot recommend enough trying to get your hands on a case or two of the new release. If not for eventual drinking pleasure, then almost certainly for some financial return on the ever-burgeoning South African secondary market. In case it wasn't obvious, the 2003 Cabernet Sauvignon was the highlight of the day for me, and having tasted the 2018 alongside it with all its concentration and persistence and power, I can say that this is going to be an incredibly exciting wine that is definitely worth waiting 25 years for. And finally, we get to the scores. But before I can just list them outright, I again need to give a little bit of context by making my scoring philosophy a little better understood. Because I think there is some confusion out there caused by so-called speculative wine scoring. Now, speculative wine scoring is issuing a score out of 100 points that already includes the perceived potential of a wine, i.e. you would score a wine now for the 98 points that it may or may not earn in 20 years' time. I do not do this. Mostly because there is data that tells us that 95% of wine sold, at least in the United States, I would imagine it would be similar in South Africa, are drunk within 1 week of purchase. This means that scoring a wine on the potential that it might reach in 20 years' time means that only 1 out of 20 bottles will actually ever reach that. Instead, I prefer to tell you what you will get in the bottle if you buy it today, and leave it up to you whether you decide to cellar it or not. And it must be acknowledged there are other wine critics who claim not to score speculatively at all, telling you that they are scoring what is in the bottle right here and right now, as Fatboy Slim would say. But my question then is, when you give a score of 97 points on a wine that is 4 years old, what do we do if it's improved 10 years later or 15 years later? What's its final score? 103? 105? How far are we away from 105-point wines? But enough theory. Let's use an example that actually illustrates my point, coming back to the Cabernet Sauvignon 2003 and 2018. The 2018 vintage is delightful. There are herbal thyme references, a kind of mineral terracotta-like element, vibrant red cherry, and then underpinned by slightly softer, almost blackcurrant pastel elements. It really is very engaging. On the palate, the tannins present as gargantuan, but alongside of them, there's this vibrant raspberry sherbet acidity and bright red cherry. All the fruit is so vivid and intense and upfront and concentrated. I mean, it's an incredible thing to behold. Is it relaxing to drink? No, not really, but it is still enormously exciting, which is why I scored it a rigid, muscly 90 points. And at this point, you're, Han, what on earth? How can you told me I should invest in this. Why would I invest in a measly 90 points? Well, the reason is because I had the privilege of tasting the 2003 alongside. And this wine I scored at 97 points. And you might say, well, Han,
what's the difference?
Are they really that different?
Well, for starters, it'll gain about 4 points just when we discuss balance and complexity after time. After all, the tannins will soften up quite a lot and the tertiary flavors will develop, giving it a whole nother level of experience. Of course, the aromatics will dial up to a whole new level, so there's a point or two there. And then finally, in a similar vein to balance, the finish will become so much more engaging and often more lengthy in my experience, which means there's a point and a bit there as well. So it's very easy to see when you break it down into categories how a wine might shift by 7 points between year 4 and year 24. Moving on to the Paul Sauer, the wine of the day, which was released actually at the beginning of this month. So if you're wanting to get hold of it, now is the time to do so. And it really is a splendid example of the best of what South African Bordeaux Reds can be. Weirdly, I don't think it's typical Stellenbosch in the sense that it leans more towards red fruit. It's slightly lighter footed, even though the tannins are huge. It has a kind of old world, cooler climate feel about it, which I find quite distinct. I don't recognize this red fruit dominance and this elegant laser cut type acidity on many Stellenbosch Bordeaux blends. And that's something that Paul Sauer has for me in abundance. On the nose, even in its youth, it's really quite engaging with loads of cassis and red cherry and graphite, a little bit of a thyme herbal influence, and of course, some vanilla, which is not unsurprising given that Paul Sauer is a wine that sees 100% new oak for 24 months. Interestingly though, that becomes a lot less obvious over time as it begins to integrate with the fruit, or so previous vintages seem to assure me. On the palate, the structure is enormous and it has these amazing strands of red fruit woven and supported by some slightly riper sort of black currant element beneath it all. I wrote an article for Tim Atkin previously asserting that wine reviewers should be more empathetic and not just give point scores, but give genres attached to the point scores. So keeping with that, I would give the Paul Sauer 2019 an old world laser cut 92 points. 2006 Paul Sauer, however, was a completely different experience altogether, both in texture and impact and complexity, and that scored 96 points. And finally, for those of you wondering about my scores on the lower tiered Kadette range, the 2019 Kadette Cape Blend, I scored a slightly rough 88 points, but I believe this is nothing that 8 years in the cellar won't deal with. And this is supported by the fact that the 2014 Kadette Cape Blend, I scored 92 points. Okay, so that's all we have time for today. But if you enjoyed this video, why not subscribe to the HanDrinksSolo Wine channel on YouTube, where I publish at least 6 videos every single month on rising winemaking stars, unusual cultivars, and the exploration of exciting new regions within the dynamic South African winelands.